Imagine for a second that I told you George Washington didn't actually exist.
I mean, I'd probably laugh and think you were joking.
Right, you'd roll your eyes. You would immediately point to the absolute mountains of evidence we have. You'd point to the letters he wrote, the military orders he
The
signed.
portraits, the eyewitness accounts from people who actually knew him. Yeah.
Exactly. And here's the really unsettling question. What if I told you that every single one of those items was just a biased story?
Yeah.
That they were all crafted by someone with a very specific, political or personal agenda?
That is a deeply uncomfortable thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to ask, how do you actually scientifically prove a past event happened when you literally cannot see it for yourself?
And that question drops us right into, honestly, the deepest, most complex problem of historical knowledge. Because when we hold a historical document, say, an ancient letter fading on some parchment, we desperately want to believe it operates like a clear window.
Right, like we're just looking directly into the past.
Exactly. We want to look through the glass and see the past exactly as it unfolded. But the reality is, we are looking through a highly distorted, heavily tinted lens.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are exploring the epistemological battlefield of history.
Epistemological battlefield, I like that.
Yeah, and just to define that term early on for everyone listening, epistemology is really just the philosophy of how we know what we know. It's the study of truth and justification.
Right. How do we justify claiming something is a fact?
Exactly. And today, we're going to examine how our entire understanding of historical truth has radically shifted over time. Because understanding how history is written completely changes what you read.
It really does. It changes everything. But to get there, we're going to have to unpack a very specific, almost brain-bending paradox about observation and science.
I am so ready for this.
Good. Because resolving that paradox requires us to completely redefine the very nature of what a document actually is. We have to tear down some pretty deep-seated assumptions about observation, about truth, and really how we interact with reality itself.
Okay, but before we can tear down the idea of objective history, we need to understand how it was built in the first place. Right.
Oh, absolutely. You have to know the foundation before you demolish the house.
Right. So we have to travel back to the 19th century, to the roots of the positivist approach to history.
Yeah, the 19th century is key here, because this was an era deeply, deeply infatuated with the hard sciences.
I mean, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing.
Exactly. Physics and chemistry were making these massive leaps, and thinkers of the time, they wanted to apply that exact same rigorous mathematical certainty to human society.
So they wanted history to be a hard science.
Precisely. You have philosophers like Auguste Comte laying the groundwork for what we call positivism. And Comte essentially argued that the only authentic knowledge is scientific knowledge.
Meaning it has to be proven.
Right. He believed that kind of knowledge can only come from the positive, observable affirmation of theories through a strict scientific method. And when this mindset was applied to the study of the past, I mean, it created a massive paradigm shift.
And the poster child for this classic positivist form of history is Leopold von Ranke, right?
Yes. Ranke is an absolute towering figure in historiography.
He had that famous catchphrase, didn't he?
He did. His defining goal for the historian was to show the past, wie es eigentlich gewesen.
Which translates to...
It translates from German to how it actually was.
How it actually was. Wow. That is an incredibly confident phrase.
Oh, it's pure arrogance in a way.
Yeah.
Ranke believed that if you just strip away all the myth, the romance, the subsequent political spin, you can capture the pure, unadulterated reality of the past.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it implies a very specific, almost mechanical formula for discovering truth.
It really is a formula.
Right, so the positivist formula essentially goes like this. First, reality happens. Then, that reality leaves behind a physical trace, which we call a document.
Okay, yep.
Then, the historian applies the correct method to that document, and the inevitable result is objective history. Reality, document, method, objective history.
That's the dream. That is the positivist dream right there.
It sounds like they treated history like a pure crime scene, like assuming the fingerprints and the DNA, which in this case are the historical documents, will just automatically tell the whole unbiased story if you just have the right magnifying glass.
The crime scene is actually a very useful way to think about how they viewed their work. Because in the positivist mindset, the document is the DNA. It's undeniable physical proof that an event occurred in a specific way.
And the historian is just the forensic scientist in the lab.
Exactly. There's supposed to be a completely neutral observer who simply processes the evidence. The prevailing belief was that if the method is completely rigorous, the historian's own personality or their background or their politics, none of that should matter at all. The document just speaks for itself.
But history isn't a sterile laboratory,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And documents aren't DNA. I mean, a fingerprint doesn't have a political agenda.
No, it doesn't.
But a royal decree absolutely does. What if the evidence at the crime scene was intentionally planted? Or, even more importantly, what if the detective looking through the magnifying glass is inherently biased?
And that realization is exactly what brings us crashing into the 20th century reality check.
So what happened in the 20th century?
Well, the intellectual landscape completely fractured. You get this wave of thinkers in history, philosophy, and social theory, people like Michel Foucault, Hayden White, Keith Jenkins.
Heavy hitters?
Oh, yeah. And they looked at that 19th century positivist dream and just pointed out fatal flaws in the logic. They systematically dismantled the idea of the neutral observer and the objective document.
Let's break down the mechanics of that, because the critical theorists leveled three major critiques against the positivists. And the first one fundamentally changes how we view our sources. Documents are not neutral.
Right. Because a historical document doesn't just magically materialize out of the ether, It is produced by a specific human being, usually working within a specific institution, representing a specific power structure.
Give me an example of that.
Think about a medieval tax record.
Okay.
It isn't just a neutral list of numbers. It's an instrument of state control designed to extract wealth from the population. Or a royal chronicle that's designed to legitimize a king's reign. Even a private, locked diary is written to justify the author's own actions to themselves.
So they all have a motive.
Exactly. Documents are artifacts of power. They have blind spots, motivations, and agendas baked into their very creation.
Which flows right into the second critique. Documents are not the past itself.
This is crucial. A document is merely a representation of the past. It is a translation. The exact moment a historical event is written down on parchment or paper, it ceases to be the actual event. It becomes a subjective description of the event.
Right, because you can't capture everything.
No. In that translation from messy reality to structured text, immense amounts of information are lost, altered, or emphasized, entirely based on whoever is holding the pen.
To bring this into the modern day for everyone listening, just think about reading a highly polarized news article or even a heavily edited Wikipedia page. You know you aren't experiencing the raw event, right? You're experiencing a curated version of it.
Curated by someone with a perspective, yes.
And then we hit the third critique,
Yeah.
which targets the detective with the magnifying glass. The historian is not neutral.
What's fascinating here is how much we try to deny this, but every historian is a human being anchored in their own specific time and culture. When a modern historian looks at an ancient text, they can't simply turn off their modern brain.
They can't just unknow what they know.
Right. They bring their own contemporary concepts, their own ideologies, and their unconscious biases to the analysis. The magnifying glass is never perfectly clear. The glass itself is always tinted by the era the historian lives in.
So, the positivists had their clean linear formula. Reality to document, to method, to objective history. The 20th century critical theorists replace it with a much messier human formula. Document to interpretation to narrative.
Yes.
Suddenly, history transforms from a hard, objective science into an act of storytelling, literary construction, and power analysis.
It shatters the illusion entirely. Under this critical framework, history becomes less about discovering what actually happened and much more about understanding how what happened was interpreted and written down. The solid foundation of absolute historical truth simply crumbles.
Okay, but wait. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh.
Because if we follow this critical logic all the way down, we run into a massive problem. The critical theorists have successfully debunked the positivists by proving that documents are just biased representations, right?
Right.
And they argue that because we cannot directly observe the past, we cannot reach absolute objective knowledge about it.
That's their main argument.
Let's think about the foundational rule of positivism for a second. The golden rule of the hard sciences is that we cannot speak scientifically about things we cannot perceive with our senses. If we can't observe it, it isn't objective science.
That is the strict positivist criterion of observability, yeah.
So, if the critical approach uses lack of direct observability as the core reason why we can't have objective history, are they just playing by positivist rules?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right. If I say, I can't see the past directly, therefore I can't scientifically know it,
Yeah.
I'm using the exact same logic as it goes Comte. Have the critical theorists just tied themselves in a massive logical knot?
You know, it really does look like a massive own goal at first glance.
Yeah.
It seems like the critical approach has just circled back and surrendered to the positivist standard. It looks like they're saying, you positivists were right all along. Observation is the only path to science. And since historians can't observe the past, history fails your test.
They spent decades tearing down Ranke's dream of perfect objectivity, only to accidentally validate his core premise about observation. It totally feels like a trap.
It does, but to untangle this knot, we have to look at a subtle but crucial difference in how the two camps actually use the concept of observation. They are operating on fundamentally different logical tracks, even if they're using similar vocabulary.
Okay, take me down those tracks. How does a positivist view observation versus a post-positivist or critical thinker?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, for the positivist, observation is a sufficient condition. Their logic dictates that if we have observable facts, like if we have the physical documents sitting right there on the archive desk in front of us, we can achieve objective truth. The mere presence of the observable document guarantees the science.
Right, the presence of the fingerprint guarantees the conviction.
Exactly. But for the critical thinkers, the core issue isn't just the lack of direct observation of the past event. Their primary target is the fundamental nature of the evidence itself. They argue that historical knowledge isn't a direct observation of reality at all. It is strictly a process of working with representations.
Okay, so the critics aren't saying no observation means no science. They are saying you positivists completely misunderstand what you're looking at. You think you are observing a piece of the past, but you are only observing a subjective representation of the past.
Spot on. The critical approach targets the processes of representation and interpretation, not the scientific criterion of observability. It essentially dismantles the positivist assumption about what a document actually is.
Because positivism thought a document was like a frozen piece of reality transported into the present.
Right, but the critical approach realizes a document is just an interpretation trapped on paper.
That completely reframes the paradox. The critics aren't accepting the positivist playing field. They are completely destroying it.
And this realization leads directly to a profound concept in modern historical philosophy. It's known as epistemological humility.
Epistemological humility. I mean, it sounds a bit like accepting defeat, but I get the sense it's actually a more honest way to approach knowledge.
It is deeply honest.
Yeah.
And highly functional. Epistemological humility acknowledges that the past definitely exists. Things really happened. Empires rose and fell, wars were fought, people lived complex lives, but we must humbly accept that we have absolutely no direct access to that reality.
Because the barrier of time is impenetrable.
Impenetrable. We can never step into a time machine and verify the facts with our own eyes. Therefore, the old positivist formula is dead. We cannot go from reality to document to objective history. Instead, we must embrace a new, much more sophisticated formula. Reality happens. That reality is turned into a representation by someone with a specific worldview. A modern historian then applies their own interpretation to that representation. And finally, they construct a narrative. Reality to representation to interpretation to narrative.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener, the next time you consume information? And what does it mean for the historian sitting in the archive today? Because if the past is permanently trapped behind biased representations, and if every historian is bringing their own modern baggage to the table, is all history just subjective fiction?
That is the big fear.
Right. Does the historian just throw their hands in the air and write a novel instead of an academic paper?
Well, that is the great fear of total relativism. Relativism is the idea that because absolute perfect truth is unreachable, any interpretation is just as good as any other. It's the dangerous idea that nothing is objectively true, so history is just a competing set of fictions.
And if the academic community fully surrendered to total relativism, the entire discipline of history would basically collapse into meaninglessness.
It would. But historians are still researching. They are still debating, peer-reviewing, and publishing rigorous work. They clearly haven't surrendered to the abyss.
So how do they operate?
Well, most modern historians emphatically do not believe history is purely fictional, nor do they believe it's purely mathematically objective. They have found a highly functional middle ground, and this framework is known as critical realism.
Critical realism. It sounds like it combines the rigorous skepticism of the critics with the grounding belief that the past actually happened and can be understood.
That's exactly what it does. Critical realism is the stance that the past is not completely unknowable, but it is also never fully perfectly objective. We can know things about the past, and we can make highly educated, rigorous arguments about it, but we must always remain hyper-aware of the layers of interpretation involved.
How does a historian actually practice that, though? Like, we mentioned historians like E.H. Carr and Carlo Ginzburg who champion this middle path. How do they handle a deeply biased document without just throwing it away or blindly accepting it as absolute truth?
So Carlo Ginzburg's work is actually the perfect illustration of critical realism in action. He wrote a famous book called The Cheese and the Worms.
Great title.
Amazing title. And it explores the worldview of a 16th century Italian peasant, a miller named Minocchio. The only reason we know anything about Minocchio is because he was put on trial by the Inquisition for heresy.
Wow. And Inquisition records are essentially the definition of a biased document. I mean, they're created by an immensely powerful institution designed to extract confessions, often through torture, to justify condemning someone.
Exactly. So think about the approaches. A strict positivist might take the Inquisition records at face value or discard them entirely as tainted evidence.
Right.
A strict relativist might say the documents only tell us about the oppressive power of the church and tell us absolutely nothing true about the peasant.
Because it's just a fiction written by power.
Right. But Ginzburg, acting as a critical realist, read the documents against the grain. He fully acknowledged the intense bias of the inquisitor holding the pen. But he rigorously analyzed the transcripts to find the moments where Minocchio's authentic, strange, and highly original voice broke through the formalized legal language of the church.
Oh, that's brilliant. He filtered out the institutional bias to extract the historical reality of the individual.
Yes.
He used the very documents meant to suppress the peasant to reconstruct the peasant's actual life.
Exactly. Now, he didn't claim to have absolute perfect knowledge of Minocchio's soul, but he constructed a meticulously supported, rigorous interpretation. Critical realists use meticulous methodology not to find absolute truth, but to construct the most accurate, well-supported argument possible, all while openly acknowledging the limitations of their sources.
So when you pick up a history book today, you shouldn't read it as the final, unquestionable truth carved in stone. You should read it as a highly rigorous, well-argued interpretation of historical representations.
Yes, you are reading an argument.
Which demands more from you as a reader, you have to ask. Who wrote the original documents? Why did they write them? And what modern perspective is the current historian bringing to this narrative?
It makes reading history an active conversation rather than just a passive reception of facts. You are engaging with a scholar's interpretation of a series of representations.
Let's take a moment to briefly recap the intellectual journey we've just taken, because we've covered a massive amount of philosophical ground today.
We really have.
We began in the 19th century with the positivist dream. Thinkers like Leopold von Ranke believing that if you apply the right scientific method to historical documents, you can perfectly reconstruct the past how it actually was.
Then we hit the 20th century reality check. The critical theorists stepped in and pointed out that documents are not neutral windows. They are biased representations created by power structures, and the historians reading them are not neutral either.
Which led us into the great epistemological paradox. The critics argued we cannot have objective history because we cannot directly observe the past. And it felt, just for a moment, like they were validating the strict positivist rule of observation.
But we untangled that knot by realizing the critics were actually dismantling the positivist definition of a document entirely. They introduced epistemological humility. We know the past exists, but we only have access to interpretations of representations.
And finally, we arrived at critical realism, the stabilizing middle ground that acknowledges history is not perfect, objective science. But it is also definitely not subjective fiction. It is a rigorous, deeply vital pursuit of understanding through interpretation.
It is a profound shift in how we understand the mechanics of our own past.
As we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final, lingering implication of everything we have discussed today. It builds directly on the realization that historical documents are representations of power. If our entire knowledge of history is dependent on representations, if we rely on documents that were created by specific institutions, powers, and privileged individuals, what happens to the people who never had the power to create a document?
The peasants, the marginalized, the conquered, the illiterate.
Exactly. If they lacked the institutional power or the basic literacy to leave a written representation behind in the archives, do they simply vanish from reality? If you cannot leave a document, do you cease to exist in history?
It is a haunting question, and it's honestly the frontier that modern historians are grappling with right now as they try to read the silences in the archives, looking for the negative space where those voices should be.
Something for you to ponder the next time you hold a history book. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the archive and keep questioning the narrative.